mind needs you to believe that you don't understand it, that you don't understand integration, and that, you're not aware and all of those things. Why? Because that keeps the separation in place. What is the separation? There are different forms of it. There is the actual separation of the human self from recognizing its wholeness or belonging to also a divine. So basically, the soul is existing through the human, but the human refuses to recognize that in order to be able to live the experience of separation, to live just as a small human self that is limited and does not perceive more of your capacities, of your wholeness, basically. Instead of the human perceiving itself as a soul having experiences through physicality in human form, the human perceives him or herself as basically helpless and without the full capacity to face the challenges that come forth, and therefore entitled to victimhood. And then, of course, because the victim is never separate from the perpetrator and from the savior, this is a triangle. So then that game goes on and on and on in the perpetual belief in limitation, which is, in other words, separation. Within this context, as we grow up, and I'm talking just even within one lifetime, we start creating dissociation. So we start dissociating this, that part, that part, that part, because a certain experience, or even not necessarily our experience, but an experience we are perceiving, people around us that we believe to be right, or that we believe to be the ones we need to look at as an example. So we perceive those experiences and then sort of create a kind of a mold, a format. This is called belief systems. So we create a mold that then says that something that's similar to that will necessarily result in that, right? So whenever an experience shows up that seems to be remotely similar to that one that we shaped in that mold, because at that moment there was always, this is associated with discomfort, pain, fear, some sort of what we generally call trauma, but trauma is usually maybe seen as something much bigger. But anything that is kept locked in time and space as a means of managing, of self-management, is trauma. So seen in a vaster sense. We go about in survival mode, obviously, because we don't realize that keeping those things separate makes them seem much harder, and it keeps us limited because we only see boxes. So this is this, and that is that, and that is that, and this is dissociation. There's this part that is like this, and that part that argues with that part, and all of that noise that goes on in the mind, that is dissociation. And it's used to get by. It's used to survive. So because all of these experiences are lived in a somehow painful or uncomfortable way, they make us kick into survival mode. So there is a permanent alertness, something in the background, always watching, making sure that things work out in the way which is not necessarily the right or the wrong way. It's simply the way you have managed to perceive to be a way that works. So it worked that time. But that time you were I don't know, in your mom's belly, or 5 months old, or 2 years old, or 5 years old. Okay. So this keeps on happening in this way as we grow until more or less teenage years. It could be usually 12, 13, 14, and it usually stops there in a sense, as everything you've learned in those first 2 7-year cycles will determine everything you believe in, the way you perceive and see. Then you grow up, obviously, and you're always comparing whatever challenges that to something else. And then, of course, some of those belief systems collapse, but many of them stay for the pure reason of survival, because the one that you perceive yourself to be thinks that if you deviate, then you will eventually be ostracized, excommunicated, no longer have anyone to love you. So it all comes from a fear of abandonment, and usually a sense of abandonment during childhood. It can be something really simple, but that the child perceived that way. And of course, there are phases in life where we question ourselves. Does this make sense? Does that? I mean, because of course, sometimes you grow out of those belief systems, they no longer fit you. But then sometimes you create others that are equally limited, in the sense that they still are created from a point of fear, of survival, of I have to preserve my physical integrity. Somehow I have to do this way because, and then you start watching TV and listening to more and more conversations and learning history and all of that stuff and how things worked there and there and there. And this shapes your reality. So all of this is dissociation. Like, it's not cohesive. That's where you feel confused, because then there's sort of so much information from your own experiences and others that at some point it creates confusion. Unfortunately, it does, because confusion produces revolution and evolution. It's in those moments where people get so confused they get depressed, that great opportunities to transcend those limitations appear, because it has to hurt enough for us to want to change it. At some point, that which was created to cope with some kind of pain becomes more painful than the initial pain itself. And every single human being, of course, has intuition, but many times does not listen to it because it goes against the norm. It's usually so quiet and simple. It seems too simple, really, to be a real solution, etc. So then it becomes harder and harder to listen to intuition, which is basically your inner tutor. And so then you're always listening to all of everything going around outside, performing in those stages, but then not listening to the one within, right? At some point in some lifetime, we come to that point, or in several lifetimes, sometimes it goes back and forth, to start tapping into more of that knowingness. And it just then naturally goes deeper. And then you start realizing, wait a minute, what is lacking is more of me. And more of me means love. And so then, as you connect to your soul essence, and you do that just by becoming present, by allowing that's why the breath is a vessel for that kind of safe space where you can feel your presence. Then you start feeling this urge to reunite. there's all of those little bits and pieces hanging out there. You just feel it so strongly that it all has to come back into wholeness. That
Yeah.
is integration. So you can go back and forth with this. So you sometimes it's really strong and yes, there's nothing else I want. But then because there's all of these parts that have been in control for so long, you have to be firm enough to not go along with that and to stay true to your choice. That's where your clear conscious choice is required. And it seems like a struggle just because you feed everything else much more than just staying and allowing. So it's not a struggle, but it seems to be a struggle because you struggle against yourself. And the idea or the invitation from your soul is not ever against. That's why this is called compassionate breath and it is done through compassion. Because if you keep on going against, how can you integrate? It's the opposite movement, right? So the struggle really is just happening in your mind. It's not a real struggle. That's why we call it illusion. It's
Yeah.
just like we have come to develop such professional use of stress in modern societies that have provided people with chronic stress over things that are invisible. Stress is a natural biological mechanism to be used very seldom and only in situations where a true threat presents itself, and then you have to choose to fight or flee, which would be, mammoth running towards you, or one of those big tigers or whatever. Not that you don't have money to pay the credit, the house credit or whatever, the house
Right.
loan and stuff like that. But
Right.
we've created things in such a way that daily life has become so busy that the fight or flight response is always there. If you're aware of it, then you can question it. And it makes it much harder to make that transition also because adrenaline is addictive.
Mm.
So it's not like you're an alcoholic or a drug addict per se, but you are because the drug is running in your own veins and you're producing it. So that's why it's even harder to wean oneself off that than off any other kind of addictive drug. You can create so many situations on a daily basis that will produce that effect. Then it's becoming aware. Okay, a thing happens and it's triggered. At that moment, you can choose to go along with the trigger or to take a deep breath and let that go. That's how you change. As long as you're judging it as
Yeah.
something bad, it will never ever start diluting. It's all around us. If you don't take it so personally, like the victim is in you, but it's a prevalent mechanism used to keep the human separate. If you don't look at it as something so personal, you can come to accept it as part of a way of living and dealing with life, but not the only way. The thing is that for that victim to dissolve gradually, because it doesn't happen all at once, because the victim is in many personality aspects, you see, there's not just one aspect that is the victim. Just the same way as there's not just one aspect that is the abuser. It's in many aspects of personality. They have that trait. You can't own it as something like, oh, I'm a victim. Well, yeah, you're behaving like a victim,
Yeah.
thinking like a victim, but you're not necessarily just that. For it to dissolve, you have to be the one that, because it's always children that they come back home to. Now, if there's no responsible adult at home that is taking care of the home, making sure it's a comfortable place, a place where these children can feel safe and loved and cared for, they're not going to come. And the point is, it used to be your parents or whoever had that role, but now it cannot be, because it cannot be anyone outside of you. Be your own mother and father that holds these children and says, it's okay now, you don't need to be afraid anymore. And it's basically realizing you are the one, you are the responsible co creator that can choose to stay here instead of being that aspect. So, I mean, if a part of you comes up and you are instantly it, so you identify with it, then how is it gonna not be it? How can there be compassion? Compassion sits within the observer, within the soul, obviously, but also within that human part which has said, I want reunion. In that moment, you see, you're aware of it, but you don't question it. Do I really need this? Or in what way is this serving me? It has to be serving you, otherwise it
Yeah.
wouldn't be there. So then you actually realize, oh wow, this is creating this or this. It gives you energy, whatever. It does something that for you has been productive, and that's why it's still there. And as long as you're in rejection, you're never gonna admit that. And if you don't admit that, then you cannot choose differently. You cannot say, okay, so this purpose for which this is has been serving me, I choose it. I don't choose it anymore. I'm choosing something new. And only when you are fully conscious of, oh wow, yeah, this is how this has served me so far. And it's many times people reply, oh, it's useless. Oh, I don't like it. I don't need it anymore. Yeah, okay, but before you go into it's useless, you have to realize it has been useful. You always
Yeah.
get energy for sure. And exactly what you're saying exactly is the attention. Attention carries energy. So it's a vehicle. The victim abuser savior pattern, which is within every human, is
Yeah.
an energy carrier, right? It just serves that purpose to bring energy, but always in lack. So it's always never enough. It's just very short bursts of energy, then you need more. Now versus the other kind of energy that you feel when you really just stay in your wisdom, and you're in that space where you feel cool and safe there, that gives you a completely different type of energy. That is what we call new energy, because it's not deriving from past experience or need or expectation or lack or separation. Because the point is, in your belief systems, it is on the record that when you're in chaotic situation like traffic, whatever,
Yeah.
you have to perform as a survivor. Otherwise, you don't get by. But that's
Yeah.
just because you haven't tried any other way. People find it hard to change. And the probability of picking a fight or whatever when you get home after something like that is much higher. Why? Because you're depleted. You need to get energy somewhere. Perceiving, okay, Who is this that is feeling like this? Then you step out of that. Because as long as you're in it, as long as you are it, you can't see anything else. Seeing yourself as an actress, as a someone playing a role, instead of being so identified with that you, helps you gain perspective. Oh, there I am playing that role. Just perceiving, oh, I'm playing that role. Okay, let me
Yeah.
shift.